Thank you, Naomi. Good morning, everybody. Well, just how brilliant was that to see our young people put on that first part of our service for us. So much thought and effort, as Naomi said, went into that. And just think that actually that was happening in the George as well. So there were more of our young people in the George doing the same thing. Isn't that fantastic that we've got such a group of young people with us? It's tremendously encouraging. So thanks again, guys. That was really good. So, Ecclesiastes. Excited this morning? Wow. Ecclesiastes. Book that's been around for 2.5 millennia. But it's one we believe is part of the inspired Word of God. And it's a book that's so relevant, actually, to life in this nation at this very hour in our history, which is not our finest hour. Is it? It really isn't. So this morning we're going to read some verses from chapter 2, and it's quite a lengthy chapter, so I've kind of just dipped in and picked out a selection of verses. Not going to talk about them all, but I feel that this sort of gives us scope of the whole chapter. Beginning at verse 1, then dropping down to verse 10, reading a couple of verses and so on through the chapter. I said to myself, "Come now, I will test you with pleasure, to find out what is good." But that'll also prove to be meaningless. Or fleeting, we feel's a better translation there, actually. Verse 10, I deny myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labour, and this was the reward for all my toil. And yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom, and also madness, and folly. Verse 15, I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is fleeting, meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not long be remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. And like the fool, the wise too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me, and all of it's meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish. Yet they'll have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is transient. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labour under the sun. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge and happiness. But to the sinner he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, chasing after the wind. I came across a web page entitled Life's Great Mysteries. Allow me to share a few with you. How does the man who drives the snowplow get to work? Thought about that. It's a mystery. How much deeper would the ocean be if sponges didn't grow in it? You know, who knows? It's a mystery. If it's 0 degrees outside today and it's supposed to be twice as cold tomorrow, how cold is that? 2 times 0. Okay. One more. We say the lights went out, but where do they go? Good questions. Another of life's mysteries. But more seriously, in an interview with a Washington-based radio station, Paul Simon, that brilliant singer and songwriter, was asked about the mysteries of life, and here's part of his reply. He said this: we don't have the capacity to understand the great mysteries of life, and God or no God or infinity, we just can't get it. It's beyond us, but that's fine. We're not meant to get that. But the pursuit is so interesting. That, I think, is life-sustaining. And I think when you lose the interest in that pursuit, you're finished. Well, there's some sense in what Paul Simon said there, and he's entitled to his opinion, but there are many who would argue with him with regard to whether or not we do have the capacity to understand at least some of the great mysteries of life. Indeed, some would say they've cracked the biggest mystery of them all, the very meaning of life itself. For instance, that vastly underrated philosopher, Arnold Schwarzenegger. He said this: the meaning of life is not simply to exist, to survive, but to move ahead, to go up, to achieve and to conquer. There's a very famous American poet and writer called Philip Appleman, and Appleman said this: whatever we are, whatever we make of ourselves, is all we ever have. And that, in its profound simplicity, is the meaning of life. Sounds deep, doesn't it? Like, yeah, man, bring it on. Whatever you say. Pablo Casals, on the other hand, who was a great cellist and composer, he said this: I feel the capacity to care is the thing which gives life its deepest significance. And that may be true for some people. And that's a noble thing, isn't it? Caring for other people. But then the film director and producer, Michael Crichton, suggested that the purpose of life is to stay alive. Really? Is that it? Sorry?
Doomed to failure.
Doomed to failure, absolutely, because 1 out of 1 dies. The great mysteries of life, it was one of those that Ecclesiastes' central character set out to unravel. He says in chapter 1, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. And that central character, the one that the writer calls the teacher, was probably Solomon. Not the person who actually wrote the book. Remember last time when I introduced the book, I said probably Solomon didn't write it. But he's probably this central character who the author kind of looks back on his life and the things that he said and the things that he did. And he writes the book years or even centuries after this great Israeli king passed away. He was the person whose experience the book was based on, Solomon. And the more I think about it, the more likely that seems to have been, because it's hard to think of any other figure actually in the Old Testament era who would have had the wherewithal, financially and intellectually, to undertake this great series of experiments that we're about to look at in chapter 2. And we're going to consider these under 5 simple headings, and the first of them is his goal. His goal. The reason that he started such a quest. To use Paul Simon's word, this pursuit of an answer to one or more of life's mysteries. Why did he do it? What was his goal? Here are some verses I didn't read to you earlier. In verse 2, it says this: laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. Here it is. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. Interesting. He sets out on this epic journey of discovery, he says, because he wanted to see what was good for people to do with their lives. So at least it seems on the face of it, his reason, his goal was altruistic, it was unselfish, he was thinking of others. He realized that this was a question that many people in life think about and that many more perhaps ought to think about, and so he sets about finding an answer. What is it? What is it that truly gives meaning to life? Is there anything? Was the whole thing just pointless? Worthless? What is good for people to do during the few days of their lives? His goal was to find an answer to that mystery. It was, as we say, a noble cause. And if the teacher was Solomon, then he certainly had the resources to tackle such a conundrum, didn't he? Because in 1 Kings and chapter 10, verse 23, we're told that King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. And when that mysterious lady, the Queen of Sheba, came to see him, On account of his fame spreading far and wide, and she picked up on the fact that there was this magnificent king in Jerusalem. The Bible tells us that when she saw all the wisdom of Solomon, and the palace he built, and the food on his table, and the seating of his officials, etc., etc., she could barely believe what she heard. And barely believe what she saw. Such was the authenticity of Solomon's reputation. He lived up to the fame that had spread about him. In fact, he surpassed it. So if Solomon was the teacher, then he was possibly one of the best placed people ever to take on this particular challenge, for God had endowed Solomon with amazing wisdom and immense wealth. So that perhaps was another reason for him pursuing such a quest. The fact that he had literally all he needed to do it, leaving no stone unturned. Perhaps he just took on the challenge because he could. He had the wherewithal to do it. So, how did he set about it then? Well, let's consider secondly his plan. What does he do to find out these answers? Does he begin by calling for a priestly assembly, perhaps, calling together all the religious leaders in his nation? Does he call together a symposium of philosophers and wise men? Does he get out his scrolls and search them for answers? No, he doesn't. Not as far as we know. And nor as far as we know does he get on his knees and ask God to speak to him and then wait humbly for the Almighty to reveal his truth on the matter. As far as we know, he doesn't do that. On the contrary, Solomon's plan, if he had a plan at all, was simply to try a variety of lifestyles in order to see if any of them conveyed any sense of ultimate meaning and purpose in life. He just went headlong into this whole journey of trying this and trying that and trying the other. His plan was to explore and to experiment. He started with what we call hedonism. And hedonism, my dictionary says, is the pursuit of pleasure or the pursuit of sensual indulgence, that which pleases the flesh, the physical part of us. Come now, he says in verse 1 of chapter 2, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. So what kind of pleasures did he try? Well, laughter, for a start. Doesn't tell us what actually caused him to laugh. Maybe a good old dose of slapstick, perhaps, or some stand-up comedy from a court jester, or whatever it was, didn't work for him. Oh, he probably broke into a smile or a chuckle here and there, but in terms of the mystery of life that he was researching, his comment verges on the dismissive. He says it's madness. For your life about is laughter, it's madness. Does that mean Christians shouldn't laugh? We shouldn't enjoy a giggle every now and again? I think so, do you? Not at all, because it was lasting value that Solomon was looking for, something that endured beyond the end of the age as we know it. He was looking for ultimate meaning. That's what he was hoping to find, and although laughter can make no claim to providing that, it can certainly do us some good in the meantime, can't it? Oh, one or two of you are in favour. I've got a laugh out of you then. And more muscles on your face move than when you frowned at me. So it's good exercise, laughter. Does you good. Does something in the body. Certain chemicals start moving around and you feel better if you have a good laugh. I gave a talk here once, many years ago now, called The Divine Gift of Humour. Because that's what I think it is. Don't you? That humour is God's invention. He created all things good. And humour is one of those things. A gift from God himself. The ability to chuckle. Wonderful. When was the last time we thanked God for that? But having written off laughter as somewhat silly, to use the New Living Translation's word, the teacher then tries cheering himself with wine. What a lovely phrase. Cheering himself with wine. What are you doing, dear? It's only 6 o'clock. I'm cheering myself with wine. Just like that good King Solomon. And along with the wine came a further dose of silliness, though apparently not on account of the wine, because the words that are used there give no suggestion of drunkenness. But neither the wine nor the folly yielded any lasting gain, so the king moved on. And this time he moved on to something more substantial. Because having cleared away his goblets and his corkscrews, he says in verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. And at the end of verse 7, he says, I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. So he turns his mind to architecture. He puts his hand to horticulture and to agriculture. He has the cash, so why not use it to build something that will last? I don't know if you noticed, all his nouns were plural. Did you notice I deliberately pronounced the S's at the end of all those nouns? Houses, projects, parks, and so on and so on. He didn't just build one of everything. He built loads of houses and parks and all the rest of it. It was a real treat this past week to visit a place called Durham Park. It's just north of Bath. It's a National Trust property. What a wonderful place. It's in a stunning location. It's surrounded by 274 acres of formal gardens and beautifully planned parkland. And this property that's in the heart of it, this magnificent building, was built for a William Blaithwaite back in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. But although a number of Blaithwaites lived there for a little while, it's now owned, as I say, by the National Trust, and none of its dead owners or residents are enjoying anything of consequence of their relationship with that building. As Solomon soon discovered, in terms of eternity, even buildings and parks and so on is hebel. That's the Hebrew word that we looked at last time. It's a chasing after the wind. It's temporary. It's fleeting. So he moves on again. And in verse 8 he says, I amassed. Love that word that the NIV uses there. I amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. But you know, his heart was still empty. And his soul was still parched. Because he says nothing was gained under the sun. Jeff Strite is an evangelist in a town called Logansport in Indiana, USA, and in a sermon on this chapter, Strite said this: there's nothing wrong with pleasure. It's like there's nothing wrong with laughter. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. God designed us, he says, to have pleasure in this world. In fact, when God created Adam and Eve, he prepared a special place for them to live in. And what was the name of that special place? It was Eden, the Garden of Eden. Is Eden here? Is she here? No, she doesn't. Anyone know what Eden means? Means place of pleasure. Where did Adam and Eve live? Where did God put them? In the place of pleasure. You see, Solomon's message is not that pleasure is futile per se, and even less that pleasure is inherently sinful. He's simply saying that in terms of the longer term, with respect to forever, it's little more than smoke. It's impossible to keep hold of. It's of no enduring worth. You know, all around the world today, there are billions of people, billions, who just want more stuff. Just want more stuff. I don't have the figures for our country, but in 2017, Americans spent $240 billion on goods like jewelry and watches and books and luggage and electronic equipment. $240 billion. That figure literally doubled in the space of 15 years. In 2002, it was half of that. Again, I don't have the exact figures, but I've seen a piece of research just this past week that says that the average human being spends almost as much time looking at a screen, a tablet, a TV. I'm not talking about at work, just for pleasure, looking at a screen almost as much time as he or she does working. And that's an incredible statistic. In other words, the amount of time we spend on play or pleasure or forms of entertainment has rocketed as well. And yet, at the very same time, the numbers of people who are battling depression, who are living with addiction, who are struggling with debt, or are taking their own lives, has also tragically escalated. There was a man called Anthony Bourdain, that's how you say it. He was a celebrity chef, he was a writer about cookery, he was a TV personality, and he was also a self-confessed lover of pleasure. And when he was once asked, I think on television, may have been in a magazine, when he was asked about the risks and the benefits of hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, Bourdain said this, "Look, I understand that inside me there's a greedy, gluttonous, lazy hippie. I understand that. There's a guy inside me who wants to lay in bed and smoke weed all day and watch cartoons and old movies. I could easily do that. My whole life, though, is a series of stratagems to avoid and outwit that guy. But," he said, "I'm aware of my appetites. I don't let them take charge." But just 4 years later, this man whose arm was tattooed with the phrase, "I am certain of nothing," took his own life. He pursued pleasure for most of his life, but ultimately he found that it wasn't worth living for. So he committed suicide. I need to move on, but I was reminded of Jesus' wonderful story of the man who left home having taken his share of what his dad would one day leave him, and well, the money didn't last for very long. And many of you know the story. Just a little while he lived the life of a playboy. He really lived it up. He tried everything, but before he knew it, all his newfound friends had disappeared, and he found himself in a pigsty, just sitting there wondering whether or not to eat the animals' food. "But," said Jesus, when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? Here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.'" So off he goes, sets out for home. But even as he's a long way off, his father sees him, and he runs up to him, and he throws his arms around him, and he welcomes him back, and he doesn't even let him get his little speech out. He puts a ring on his finger, he puts a new robe on him, he puts sandals on his feet, and he says, "Let's have a party, let's celebrate, because this son of mine, who was dead, is alive again. He was lost and he's found." That's a picture of God saying, "Come back. Come back." You know, I'm sure that Jesus told that story for all our sakes, but particularly for life's pleasure seekers, for life's hedonists, for those disillusioned people who, having lived for fun, find out eventually that pleasure is simply not worth living. His goal and his plans, that was by far the longest bit of this talk, so don't worry that we've got 3 things left here very quickly. It's number 3, and it is his rules. Oh, I've given you more already. That's not good. His rules of engagement. His rules of engagement. The terms and the conditions under which he sets about his task. And I would say that there were probably 2 main rules. Not that he would have thought of them like this, but one which is quoted in the text, and the other which is kind of hinted at or implied in the text. We'll look at the second of those first, and it's simply this idea of Solomon's wholeheartedness in this venture. Because it seemed to me that everything Solomon did, he did with all his might. I mean, when he partied, he really partied. When he built, he really went to town. He held nothing back. He really went for it. So that should he eventually fail in his quest, it would not be for the want of trying. Here's verse 10 again. "I deny myself nothing my eyes desire. I refuse my heart no pleasure." And the second rule is even more explicit, because in verse 3 he says, "I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly," note this, "but my mind was still guiding me with wisdom. And in verse 9, the end of verse 9 says, in all this experimentation, my wisdom stayed with me. So whatever it was he was trying, however fully he entered into that experience, he made sure that he somehow maintained a wise perspective on the whole experiment. He clung on to his God-given wisdom. There aren't too many experimental philosophers who could say that they did that. In all of this, he says, in the laughter, in the wine, in the architectural achievements, in the money, in the power, in the sex, in all of this, my wisdom stayed with me. Amazing. Those were his rules. Let's do everything wholeheartedly, and let's hang on to wisdom. I know it's a totally different context, but how greatly should you and I, as God's people today, endeavour to embody those two great characteristics? To be wholehearted with regard to our devotion to Christ, and to speak and act with genuine wisdom in all that we do for Christ. May God help us to do this increasingly in our world. People need wisdom. People need passion. Fourthly, extremely briefly, his experience. Bear in mind, I've not had time to deal with everything that he tried, because he talks about madness, he talks about toil. I've not touched on either of those, but for the sake of time, we'll jump to verse 17. And he gives a 3-word summing up of his experience. And he says this very plainly: I hated life. That's it. I hated life. All of it is meaningless or transient or temporary. It's a chasing after the wind. It's unattainable. You can't catch the wind. Ever tried? How extraordinary. I mean, all that fun, all that wine, all those accomplishments, all those servants, all that dosh, all those women. And yet he says, I hated life. Hated all the things I toiled for under the sun. Hated it. How extraordinary. Why did he hate it? Here's the rest of verse 18. Because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. In other words, because they're not enduring. They don't last beyond the grave. I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Everything I've tried, everything I've built, everything I've worked for, I'm going to have to one day leave behind, because all of it's fleeting. It's ephemeral. It's impermanent. None of it will stay with me beyond the grave. And so he argues, what's the point? Wherein lies the ultimate meaning for life? It's utterly meaningless and a great misfortune. We're nearly there. His goal, the reason he took on this challenge, was essentially to save a lot of people an awful lot of grief. His plan, if he had a plan at all, was just to sample as many of life's delights as he could, as well as some of its trials. His rules were very simple. Do it all with gusto, but without waiving your wisdom. His experience was profound. I hated it. Hated it. Finally, his verdict. The essence of which is another 3-word phrase, which comes at the start of verse 25, which says this: for without him. That's his verdict. That's the nub of the heart of the reason for life's apparent futility and transience. To paraphrase verses 24 and 25 in my own words, if you haven't got God in your life, then you can do no better than to enjoy the fruit of your own work for as long as your life may last. And that's it. If you haven't got God in your life. For without him. But with him, life's very different. Because for one thing, God blesses the believer with wisdom and knowledge and happiness, he says. That's verse 26. And for another thing, that we've got to wait actually to chapter 3. I'm stealing Peter's thunder for next week. But in chapter 3, it says this: God has also set eternity in the human heart, and everything God does will endure forever. Everything God does will last. So without God, everything's lost, but with God, everything will last, and everything is gain. Friends, we are living today in a broken, dissatisfied, bankrupt world, far from getting better. As our knowledge increases, things are getting progressively worse for most of our planet's people. Agreed? So surely the Lord's return cannot be all that far away.
Amen.
So in the meantime, therefore, our primary task, yours and mine, must surely be to so live out the gospel in the power of the Holy Spirit that our neighbours and contemporaries will have an opportunity to find the one, the only one, who can make any sense of it all. Jesus. The only one who can make sense of it. Many years ago, and some of you have heard me tell this story before, many years ago, the evangelist J. John, with whom I had the pleasure of working on a mission, was talking to a student at a university mission. And he said to this guy, after a little bit of conversation, he said to him, "What was your birth?" And this student looked back at him and he said, "Well, it was an accident." Okay, he says, "John, what's your death going to be?" And he said, "Oh, it's going to be an accident." All right, says John, "What does that make your life then?" And the student replied, "It's an accident suspended between two accidents." That's how he summed up his life. A university student. It's an accident suspended between two accidents. Is that true? Is that true? No, it isn't true. Are we sure? Yes, we are sure. How come? Because Jesus has told us, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," because theirs is what? The kingdom of heaven. And blessed are the meek, because what? They will inherit the earth. And blessed are the pure in heart, because what? They will see God.
Amen.
So what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about the lost? Those who think that they're little more than accidents, little specks on a tiny planet in infinite space who mean nothing at all. What are we going to do? Well, we must tell them of Jesus, friends. We must. We must tell them of his love. We must tell them that with him life can be enjoyed in all its fullness. Not that there's never heartache. Not that there's never difficulty. But we can enjoy this earthly life in its fullness and live it for all it's worth. And beyond it, there's something even greater. Even more wonderful. May God help us and equip us and direct us and use us in this venture for the sake of his glory and kingdom. Amen.